Welcome everyone to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. We're so thrilled to have Tony Michels back here on our stage for today's talk about Chaim Zhitlovsky. For those that are less familiar with YIVO, YIVO is a wonderful place for the contemplation and the celebration of Jewish history and Jewish culture. At the center of YIVO is our archive and library, which contain over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books. Scholars and researchers come from around the world to use YIVO's materials, and we make them and the stories that they tell available to the public in a variety of other ways through public programs, educational initiatives, and exhibitions. And we hope that you'll keep coming back and learning with us. We have a wonderful archive of public programs on our YouTube channel. We have online education resources, the wonderful YIVO Encyclopedia, and more. So welcome to YIVO, and we hope that you'll come back. Now I'm going to just say a quick word about Professor Tony Michels. Tony Michels teaches American Jewish history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he also serves as director of the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies. He's author of A Fire in Their Hearts, Jewish Socialists in New York, editor of Jewish Radicals, A Documentary History, and co-editor of the Cambridge History of Judaism, Volume 8, The Modern World, 1815 to 2000. Today's talk on Chaim Zhitlovsky is a part of YIVO's Yiddish Civilization Lecture Series, which is an annual series we started last summer, where we break out from our Yiddish summer program. We've got a Yiddish language immersion summer program teaching over 100 students from around the world Yiddish. And this is something that is both for the students and also for the wider public. And we've got talks on Mondays in Yiddish and talks on Thursdays in English. And before I hand it over to Tony, I'd want to introduce the academic director of the summer program, David Brown, and David will say a quick word.
Very quick word. I just wanted to say Baruch haba to Tony, who is back at the summer program after being a student in it in 1991 and 1992, and a very particular moment that I will never forget was our Siyum Hazman, our graduation ceremony, when he received particular accolades for his participation in the program back in, I think it was 92. I won't get into details. Anybody who was there would remember it too, I'll bet. And it's a pleasure to have him back. Tony, the word is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex, for inviting me, and David for that lovely introduction. David was one of the instructors when I was there in 91 and 92. And so it's nice to be reunited. I would have kept going, I'm sure, if I was able to continue with the summer program, but I couldn't. Those 2 summers were really wonderful for me. So it's great to be back participating in this way in the Zoomer program. I'm going to speak on Chaim Zhitlovsky, the major theoretician of Yiddish culture in the United States, where he lived much of his life, although he's from the Russian Empire, and a figure who, on the one hand, was extremely influential during his own lifetime. He influenced many of the early Russian Jewish parties prior to World War I, including the Bund. He was one of the first Russian Jewish thinkers to put forward the idea of national cultural autonomy and national rights for Jews. Shimon Dubnov, the great Jewish historian, was another one, his contemporary. So he was a very influential in developing ideas about Jewish nationalism, and Jewish cultural nationalism, in his case, Yiddishism, the ideology around that held that Yiddish was a national language of the Jewish people and ought to be permanently. So he was very influential in his own lifetime in Eastern Europe and the United States and beyond. And on the other hand, he's somebody who's generally forgotten today. In the world of academia, he's certainly known to historians of modern Jewish history. But beyond that, he's not all that well known. And in fact, his disappearance, I would say, from Jewish consciousness happened very quickly, surprisingly quickly, or remarkably quickly after World War II. He died in 1943. He was born in 1865. He died in 1943. And very shortly after that, he, as I say, kind of all but disappeared from the consciousness of American Jews. There are several reasons for that. I'll just state at the outset. One is that he wrote mostly in Yiddish, or early on he wrote in Russian, then moved entirely into Yiddish. And he produced volumes of writings, which have been collected in two distinct volumes of Gesammelte Schriften, collected writings, but almost nothing has been translated into English. Some essays here or there, but just a tiny fraction of his work has been translated. Some of it has been translated into Hebrew, but almost nothing into English. So his writings are just not accessible. So that's one reason, I think, for his obscurity. Another is that he, much of what he advocated did not come to fruition. Yiddish did not become the everyday language of the Jewish masses in the United States or elsewhere. I think that has a lot to do with this. Of course, the reasons are well known. The Holocaust in Europe destroyed much of almost the entirety of the Yiddish-speaking population there. In the Soviet Union, a combination of forced assimilation and voluntary assimilation led to the demise of Yiddish there. In Israel, Hebrew became the national language, or a national language, but Yiddish did not have that status. And in the United States, assimilation as well took its toll, along with the end of immigration from Eastern Europe. So there are a host of reasons why Zhitlovsky, again, slipped into obscurity and did so quickly, despite his own towering presence in the first half of the 20th century. It's with that in mind that I'll talk about Zhitlovsky, again, this figure who's once obscure and highly influential during his own time, and certainly deserves much more attention from scholars even than he's received. I'm not going to give I can't give in the amount of time we have a full scale examination of Zhitlovsky and his ideas, but I am going to try to focus on, I think, some of the essential aspects of Zhitlovsky's life, his political views, and his thinking about Yiddish. I mentioned already that he was born in the Russian Empire in 1865. He grew up in the city of Vitebsk in Belarus, in the old Pale of Settlement. He was raised in a middle-class family. His father was a fairly prosperous businessman and a very religious family. His parents were Lubavitch Hasidim, but they were also pretty open-minded, and they gave him a secular education as well as a religious education. Eventually, he himself left religion, as many secularly educated Jews of his generation did. And he left religion behind altogether. He joined the Russian Revolutionary Movement at a young age, eventually left Russia, wound up in Switzerland, where he studied in university, earned a PhD in philosophy, and was active in student in Russian revolutionary emigre circles in Switzerland. Switzerland was a hotbed of Russian revolutionary activity, and he was very much a part of it. He started off in the Russian revolutionary movement, not in Jewish politics, which generally did not exist in the 1880s, and only in the 1890s was it starting to form. And he was very involved in, his roots were in the Russian Revolutionary Populist organization, Narodnaya Volya, or the People's Will. He stayed active in revolutionary populist groups and helped found, he was a founder of the Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, or the SRs, was a major party in Russia. It was the largest political party in Russia at the time of the 1917 revolution, and he was part of that. It was not, as I said before, it was not a Jewish party. It was a party based in the Russian peasantry, and it appealed mostly to the Russian peasantry in terms of its political program. He was part of it at the leadership, as were a number of other Jews. So he has this background going back to the 1880s. After he left religion, after he left Judaism behind, he had this background in the Russian revolutionary movement that he carried over to Switzerland. And then in Switzerland, he developed many of his theories. He was very much affected by the pogroms of 1881, 1882. And much of his early thought in the 1880s and 1890s was tried to deal with the crisis of Russian Jewry as he saw it in the late 19th century. He spent a lot of time before he came to the United States in 1904, working out at least some of the fundamentals of his overall view of Russian Jewish or really modern Jewish problems and how to solve them. So I'll say a few words about his his views as they formed in a period of crisis. His entire outlook was formed in an atmosphere of crisis. And I would say there were four crises that formed overall the Jewish problem that as he saw it. One was communal breakdown, an erosion of the Jewish communal self-governing structures that had been in place for centuries, but in the 19th century had started to break down. So a lack of communal cohesion was something he saw as increasingly problematic, that Jews were not a cohesive community. They were losing their cohesion. A second problem, as he saw it, was assimilation, cultural and linguistic assimilation, reflected most of all for him in the loss of Yiddish, the move away from Yiddish towards Russian or German or French or English or whatever the dominant languages were in the countries where Jews lived. So that was something that bothered him. Of course, he was a product of that to some degree. He spoke Russian fluently. But he saw that a good number of Jews, especially educated Jews, were leaving the Yiddish language behind. In fact, were leaving the Jewish community behind, Jewish culture behind. And so that was a big concern of his, was assimilation. A third was economic decline. In the late 19th century, there was a growing impoverishment of Eastern European Jews. Jews were becoming poorer. They were it wasn't clear if they were being squeezed out of the economy or if they could be incorporated into the rising industrial economy. But in any case, he could see there was a trend towards impoverishment, and that was a concern for his. And then, of course, finally, anti-Semitism, especially in its violent forms, like pogroms that happened in 1881 for several years in the Russian Empire. And then there was the 1903 Kishinev pogrom, and then the pogrom wave of 1905 to 1907 and so forth. So rising cycles of violence was also an issue of concern. So between assimilation and erosion of Jewish communal cohesion, economic decline, and rising and periodic outbreaks of mob violence, Zhitlovsky saw that Russian Jewry in particular was experiencing a crisis. Russian Jewry, of course, I should just mention as an aside, was the largest Jewish population. The Russian Empire was home to the largest Jewish population in the world. So he had a special concern with Russian Jewry, but it was not his only concern. So that was the atmosphere of crisis that that Zhitlovsky was dealing with in the 1880s and 1890s. I'll just say now as an aside, Zhitlovsky did not stand alone. There was a growing number of Jewish intellectuals who were also grappling with the same combination of problems. They didn't always prioritize those problems in the same way. They didn't always, they certainly did not answer or address the problems in the same way. But Zhitlovsky was one of a growing number of Jewish intellectuals who were troubled by these developments that I outlined. So just keep that in mind. He was not operating in a void, although I'm speaking about him as an individual. He was part of a community of, or at least a rising number of Jewish intellectuals who were trying to address the same set of problems. And Zhitlovsky, like his contemporaries, was interested, was dedicated himself to the very difficult task of trying to formulate a total, all-encompassing solution to these multiple problems that were besetting Russian Jewry and Eastern European Jewry as a whole. He was focused all his energies on that. Even at, well, I shouldn't say all his energy, sorry, that's not accurate. He focused much of his energies on addressing these problems, but he also had his foot in the Russian revolutionary movement, as I already said. He was involved in the Russian revolutionary scene and in the emergent scene of Jewish politics, both at the same time. That was important for reasons I'll return to down the line. And Zhitlovsky, one of his first tasks, theoretical tasks, tasks in the realm of theory, was to develop a philosophy that fused socialism and Jewish nationalism. Zhitlovsky was both those things. He was a revolutionary socialist, as I indicated, but by the 1890s, he was a Jewish nationalist as well. He needed to come up with a theory. He felt the need to come up with a theory that harmonized or synthesized the nationalism, his nationalism, and his revolutionary socialism. The reason for that was that most socialists saw nationalism and socialism as antithetical. So he had to find a way of explaining that they weren't. And so let me start by saying, describing for you his views of Jewish nationality. And this is, again, I'm talking about an early formative period, let's say the 1890s up to 1903, the Kishinev pogrom. In his view of Jewish nationality was this. He said that Jews are a nation and had been a nation throughout history. It was a nation that Jews formed a nation that lacked a territory, but that was okay. That didn't make them any less of a nation without a territory. I'll just allude to Shimon Dubnov again, who agreed with him on this. Dubnov was not a revolutionary socialist. He was a political liberal, but he had a similar view of Jewish nationality, meaning a nation, the Jews formed a nation without a territory. Most contemporaries of theirs, Jewish or not, certainly most non-Jewish thinkers, did not recognize Jews as a nationality, precisely because they lacked a territory. The view was any true nation had to have a territory, or at the very least had to constitute a majority in a particular territory where they lived. Jews didn't have either. They didn't have their own territory. They certainly didn't have their own state. And they didn't anywhere form a majority in any given territory where they lived. So how could they be a nation? Zhitlovsky's response was this. He said that since antiquity, Jews formed a cultural nation. They lacked territory, but it didn't make them any less of a nation. In fact, in some ways, that made them a superior nation because they weren't bogged down with maintaining armies and the coercive aspects of statehood. They were freed from that, and they developed on a higher spiritual plane or intellectual, cultural plane since antiquity. And prior to the modern period, Zhitlovsky said, religion was absolutely crucial to the maintenance of Jewish nationality. As he viewed it, Jews were a nation first. Religion was a device, it was a tool to maintain their national existence. And it was a very effective one for many, many centuries until the onset of the modern period, when the Enlightenment posed challenges to all religious thought, Judaism included, and that the combination of Enlightenment ideas that called into question faith and supernatural ideas and so forth in favor of rationality. The combination of Enlightenment plus emancipation, giving Jews equal rights as citizens and integrating them or trying to integrating them into the dominant majority, that combination started to weaken Jewish nationality in the 19th century. So the Jewish nationality was undergoing a severe challenge. And in this challenge, religion couldn't rise to the occasion because religion had lost its legitimacy in the face of Enlightenment ideas. And this was evidenced by the increasing number of Jews, intellectuals first and foremost, who were losing their faith in God and were no longer observing Jewish traditions, laws, and rituals, and no longer saw Jewish texts as authoritative. Zhitlovsky was one of those people. So religion was losing its hold. And but Jews still formed a nation, albeit one in crisis or facing serious challenges. So what could replace religion? Something had to replace religion, Zhitlovsky argued. And the substitute for religion, he said, was language. Language was the key in the modern era to maintenance of a national culture. This, he said, is a universal fact. This is true of all nationalities, not just Jews, but especially for Jews. And that language had to be Yiddish. And here's where Zhitlovsky started to diverge from a number of other contemporary Jewish nationalist thinkers, none of whom at the time said Yiddish, elevated Yiddish to the privileged position of being the national language or the proposed national language of the Jewish people. This is just a proposal and it's an argument that Zhitlovsky was making about Yiddish. He said Yiddish was the national language of the Jewish people, even though Jews didn't necessarily recognize it in those terms. It performed that function as being the national language of the Jewish people. And he said it for a couple of reasons. One is that the vast majority of Jews in the world, certainly in Europe, but since most Jews in the world lived in Eastern Europe, Yiddish, in as much as it was the spoken language of almost all Jews in Eastern Europe in the 1890s, that it had to be the national language of the Jews. It was just by majority rule, the numbers alone situated Jews in that way. It emphasized the importance of Jews. It secured the significance of Yiddish as the majority of the mass of Jews. So the numbers alone justified viewing Yiddish this way, said Zhitlovsky. And the degree to which, to the degree to which Jews, especially Jewish intellectuals, did not see this, it had to do with their own ideological blinders. That there were so many ingrained prejudices against Yiddish that it prevented intellectuals, leaders, and even a fair number of common Jews from seeing how significant Yiddish was. According to the prejudiced view, Yiddish was not a true language. It was a bastardized view, a version of German. It was a dialect. It was a jargon. Those are some of the words used to describe Yiddish. They didn't see it as a genuine, authentic, legitimate religion. And that, again, came from prejudice, not from an objective view or assessment of the language, according to Zhitlovsky. So because of ideological blinders, prejudices against Yiddish, people just didn't see its significance. But it did, he argued, function as the majority language. It was a legitimate language, he said, and it was a language that Jews needed to be proud of, to affirm, to cultivate, and commit themselves to in the future. That was one argument he made for the importance of Yiddish. It was already in use among the majority, and it had to be recognized as having the dignity of a full-fledged language, if still comparatively underdeveloped one. He also argued that Hebrew, which of course had an illustrious history and a central significance to the development of Jewish civilization, he said, was a language that was confined, limited to relatively small numbers of Jews. It was not a spoken language for the most part, and he considered it something akin to Latin. While he harbored no animus towards Hebrew, he didn't see it as being capable of playing the role of the national language of the Jewish people. It just wasn't used by enough people. And of course, here he's thinking of the masses of people, the workers, the everyday people, in Yiddish, the Volksmassen, who knew Yiddish but didn't know Hebrew. And he was interested in, again, think of here's where his revolutionary populist outlook is very relevant. He speaks in the name of the masses of the people. So it's nice that Talmud scholars knew Hebrew. He's fine with that, but those were Talmud scholars, and he was interested as a revolutionary socialist in the masses, the bulk of ordinary Jews, of course, who did not know Yiddish. So those are a couple of reasons why he favored Yiddish as a national language, and he envisioned Yiddish as the instrument of a new Jewish cultural renaissance that would revivify Jewish nationality. I'm going to read to you a long passage that from an essay that he wrote in 1898. The essay was called Zionism or Socialism. And it was a piece he wrote after the Zionist Congress. He was not a fan of Zionism at that point in his life. For a host of reasons, he saw Zionism as impractical, although he would later reassess that view. But I'm going to read to you a portion of this essay, so the culminating portion of the essay, because it, for the first time, or at least one of the first times, he laid out his vision of a modern Yiddish culture. It's a long passage, so please forgive that, but I want to read it to you anyway, because I want you to hear in his own words what he was saying about Yiddish and the future he imagined for it. So he writes, we hope as Jews, first, that the Yiddish literature of the Jewish people will continually grow and grow, and will attain the level of the finest European literature. We hope that the Yiddish language, which is to us as dear and holy as German is to the Germans, Russian to the Russians, and Hebrew to the old-fashioned Jews, will become all the richer in words and expressions. It is now still poor, the Yiddish language. It is poor, hard, and brittle because the learned Jews, the educated, the poets, and the belletrists write nothing in Yiddish. And only when Yiddish literature becomes rich in books and in all branches of science will the new generation not have to look for knowledge among the foreign non-Jewish peoples. He will be able to cultivate his human feelings and free thoughts in his home, in his own language. This will bind him even more to his people, Everything he will achieve in art and science will be brought out in Yiddish, and Yiddish culture and Yiddish education will grow continuously and will become a formidable force that will bind together as one, not only the educated people with the folk, but also all Jews from all countries. We Jews will have our schools, our high schools and technical schools, even our own universities. If 3 million Swiss people can support 10 universities, then the 8.5 million Jews who speak Yiddish can surely maintain 25 universities. And in such a way, Jews will become among the most educated of peoples. All right. It was a passage that must have struck readers as remarkable, possibly crazy, because almost everything he said everything he said was kind of conjured in his own imagination. There were, of course, no universities. There were no secular Yiddish schools yet for children, for high school kids, nothing. There were no secular Yiddish educational institutions at any level, let alone 25 universities. He talked about Yiddish as a national language. Almost no one's thought of it that way. He referred to Yiddish as a holy language, right? Almost no Jews thought of it as a holy language. Hebrew was Lashon Kodesh. He talked about, what else did he say? Well, we could keep going in that vein. He was imagining a future that, as he understood, he wasn't deluded, he understood did not exist yet, but believed it could be brought into existence in the course of a generation. And in that way, Yiddish would be the instrument of a national renaissance. Culture, in the way he described as a high culture, a culture of literature and language and art and science and scholarship, could replace religion. And that was the outline of his Yiddish cultural vision, as laid out in 1898 in this essay, Zionism or Socialism. At that moment, I should mention that Zhitlovsky did not believe Jews needed a territory. He was speaking purely in cultural terms, and let's say cultural and communal terms. He believed that Jews didn't need a territory, they needed a culture, and they needed communal forms of communal self-governance. And he wanted Jews, wherever they lived, to have rights, national rights, in which the state would recognize Jews and other national minorities as having the right to govern their own educational, cultural, and communal affairs. That's what he aimed towards. However, he did change his mind significantly 5 years after he wrote that essay that I just quoted from. And that was in response to the Kishinev pogrom in 1903. And he, along with others, started to recognize the importance of territory. And so he added territory to his list of goals. He wanted Jews to have a territory upon which they could build that nationality. He thought it could be in Palestine, but it didn't have to be, or not exclusively in Palestine. And he also continued to believe Jews could live a national existence through Yiddish in areas where they didn't have a territory. So he wasn't denying life in the diaspora. He still held to that view that a national cultural renaissance could happen in any number of countries in the diaspora, but he added territory to his list of demands. So his goals expanded, they didn't contract when he started advocating for a Jewish territory. And after that point, after 1903, territory was always part of his agenda. He, by the end of the decade, cooperated closely with socialist Zionists in the United States. Although he also had some strong differences with Zionism, he moved towards Zionism quite actively. And at a later point in life, he became very close in the 1930s and early 1940s. Before he died, he became close with communists, but not because he disavowed Jewish territory, a Jewish territory, and I'll get to that later. I just wanted to sketch for you the long-term political trajectory of Zhitlovsky. So to recap what I said so far, he developed an idea of Jewish nationality based on Yiddish language and culture that at first did not recognize the importance of territory. He rejected it, then came to accept it as a primary goal. And in that regard, he moved close to Zionism, but he never saw Palestine or Eretz Yisrael as the only territory upon which to build a Jewish national life. He eventually saw other possibilities, including Birobidzhan in the Soviet Union. And again, I'll get to that later, but that's where he stood in the first decade of the 20th century. The other thing to understand about Zhitlovsky so that was his idea of Jewish nationality. The other thing to understand about him is the socialism, nationalism synthesis that I alluded to before. Very quickly, he said that they don't contradict each other. Those socialists who believe that they did contradict had a faulty understanding of both internationalism and nationalism. What he meant was this, that if you understand the notion of socialist internationalism correctly, what you understood was that internationalism means cooperation and brotherhood and harmony between individual nations. Individual nations, he said, could not be escaped. They were a fact of human existence, that all people belonged to some kind of national community. And perhaps individuals could transcend those national communities, but as a whole, a people couldn't. A nation couldn't negate itself, and it certainly shouldn't be expected to. To expect nations to disappear is a violation of a basic human right. And so that was a bad idea, but that's okay that nations continue to exist, because that is only both a fact, and it's the way in which individuals express themselves through culture, their national cultures. And so the goal ought to be harmony and cooperation between all the nations, that all the nations should be recognized as equal. France or Germany or England was not any better than small nationalities like the Jews or the Ruthenians or whoever else, that no matter how small or how mighty, all nations were equal. And so a true internationalist, a socialist internationalist, would recognize this. Rather than negate nationalism, they'd seek to cultivate the national self-development of national groupings. At the same time, so that was his response to the socialists. You don't understand, he said, internationalism if you don't understand that it means recognition of nationality and with the goal of national harmony, international harmony between national groupings. He also had a message for nationalists especially right-wing nationalists who weren't socialists. And he said to them, you're mistaken if you think your nation is superior to any others. That can only lead to national oppression and war. What you need to recognize, nationalists, extreme nationalists, or national chauvinists, would be the term he used, is that all human beings have commonality. They don't just belong to nations, they belong to something bigger than nations, and that is humanity. All individuals belong then to two sets of human communities. They belong to their own nations and they belong to humanity. And so what the socialist nationalists ought to strive to do, Zhitlovsky argued, was combine those two commitments. Right? That was Zhitlovsky's project, was to combine the universal, the international, the human with the national, in his case, the Jewish national. And that was a cultural undertaking that could be achieved by taking what he said was the most progressive elements of Jewish civilization across the centuries, taking what was best and combining it into something new and progressive and human and universal, but also Jewish. That was the essential task of Zhitlovsky. And to do all of this, I want to emphasize, to do all of this in Yiddish. That was, again, crucial to Zhitlovsky, so that Jews would not have to choose between assimilation into a larger nation, or in the name of humanity, or staying Jewish, but stuck in traditional religion, which he didn't want either. Again, he wanted a combination, a synthesis of the universal and the national, the Jewish and the Gentile, or universal. As he put it in a famous essay, the essay was called Yid und Mensch. And the point of the essay was to make a case for this universal national combination, that you could strive for the universal through your own nation, and at the same time, you balance the two. In doing that, you balance the two and wouldn't have to choose. That's his general philosophical outlook when it came to Jewish nationalism, socialism, and Yiddish. Now, he brought all this to America in 1904, when he came to the United States. Prior to 1904, he had been, as I said before, in Switzerland. He had been developing these theories mainly in dialogue or an argument with other Russian Jewish thinkers, revolutionaries, philosophers, polemicists, all these people. But he had no direct contact with the Jewish masses in Russia. He wasn't living there. He had them in mind when he was talking about his ideas, when he's formulating his ideas. He had the Eastern European Jewish masses in mind, but he was not living amongst them. But in the United States, things changed for him. He came to the United States very quickly as a representative of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. He came with one of the major figurehead of that party named Catherine Breshkovskaya, revered figure in the revolutionary movement. They came to the United States. They were sent there by the Socialist Revolutionary Party to raise money for the party. They came on a speaking tour. They raised a lot of money for the party. And Zhitlovsky went back, Breshkovskaya went back, but Zhitlovsky came back a few years later, I think it was 1908, and settled in the United States permanently until he passed away in 1943. So although he was formed in Russia or in the European context, much of his life was in the United States. And in my opinion, he should be seen in some ways as an American thinker. And I say this because he addressed the problems of American Jews. He engaged very deeply with the idea of American nationality. I would say he was an early proponent of multiculturalism, although of course he didn't use that term. And I want to say a few words about that, about Zhitlovsky's view of America and how Jews should fit into America and how America should change to adapt to Jews in the other minority groups in the United States. Zhitlovsky's view, Zhitlovsky very early on in his time in America, he challenged the view of the United States as a melting pot, a term that was just coming into circulation in the first decade of the 20th century, thanks to another Jewish thinker named Israel Zangwill, whose play called The Melting Pot was a national sensation when it came, I think in 1908, 1906, something like that. But the idea of the melting pot was an old one in America. And it was basically this: everyone's heard the term, although we use it in all sorts of ways, loose ways, with no scientific or precise definition. But it roughly meant this: that the United States was a society that absorbed influences from multiple immigrant groups, assimilated different groups, and formed a national culture out of a process of assimilation and change, so that American culture was malleable, it evolved, it could absorb, but again, it was assimilatory. Zhitlovsky, not all Americans accepted that view, by the way. There were many who said, no, America's not a melting pot. America is a country of white Protestants, and everybody else needed to conform or get out. The melting pot idea was more inclusive than that, but it was still a kind of assimilationist view of America that Zhitlovsky Zhitlovsky rejected. Zhitlovsky presented a different vision of America as what he called a nation of nationalities, a kind of American version of the Russian Empire that was comprised of various national groups. His view was basically this: that America was increasingly diverse, always had been diverse, but getting more diverse all the time. There were millions of immigrants coming from all over Europe. They brought their own national traditions with them, their own cultural traditions, their own languages, and that they were actually developing their national cultures in America. And so that America was, again, becoming more, as he put it, nationally diverse. These different, this assortment of nationalities was actually the reality, he said, of America in the first decade of the 20th century. So that was his alternative vision. His view was it should be recognized as a nation of nationalities. Now, he wasn't the only person in America putting that forward. There were a number of prominent intellectuals like Horace Kalin, Rabbi Judah Magnus, Randolph Bourne, who was not Jewish. These are among the people talking about America in similar terms. Not accidentally, a number of those people were Zionists or influenced by Zionists, particularly the cultural Zionism of Echad Ha'am. So Zhitlovsky was one of a number of voices trying to persuade Americans to see the United States as a multinational, what we might today call a multicultural, diverse society. Zhitlovsky represented one of the more extreme versions, however, because of his emphasis on Yiddish as a permanent language, not just a language that was viewed as legitimate, but the permanent vernacular of American Jews. Immediately, especially in hindsight, that sounds preposterous. And at the time, certainly he had many critics inside the Jewish community who said, you're completely out of touch, Zhitlovsky, with America. If you look at America, realistically, you'll see that the trend is towards assimilation, certainly linguistic assimilation, that all the young Jews, maybe their parents speak Yiddish, they certainly do speak Yiddish, but their children are learning English. And that's the language that they speak as their first language, and will win out. Yiddish will inevitably disappear. And for this reason, which of course was a fairly accurate description, many people then saw Zhitlovsky as deluded, even as he was influential on many others. And in retrospect, certainly many people see that he was obviously wrong about this, and even, again, might say, how could he be so wrong? Couldn't he see reality? And here, I think it's important to understand Zhitlovsky's philosophy, another aspect of his philosophy. And it was, here was Zhitlovsky's response. Zhitlovsky's response to this criticism or response to those who say, look, English is the future, not Yiddish, and it's obvious for all to see if you would just open your eyes, Zhitlovsky. His response was, look, I see that English is the preferred language of most young Jews. I can see that there is language assimilation. Zhitlovsky never denied that that was taking place. His point was that there is more than one trend taking place. There is a trend on the one hand of toward language assimilation at the expense of Yiddish. He saw that, he recognized it, he never denied it. At the same time, he said that there is another process of Yiddish cultural development, And there, what he did was look at the development of Yiddish theater, literature, poetry, the emergence of Yiddish schools, which Zhitlovsky had everything to do with, the development of a robust Yiddish press, eventually the development of a Yiddish cinema, and on and on. So he said that's also happening. The Yiddish culture is growing, it's getting stronger, it's getting more sophisticated, artistically accomplished. And so there's actually two trends, not one trend. And he said the question is which trend will gain the upper hand. And here, another aspect of his philosophy is important to understand. Zhitlovsky was a firm believer in free will. He denied the notion that there were objective social processes that determined an outcome. So many of his critics said, objectively speaking, assimilation is unavoidable. There are too many dynamics at work, whether it's capitalism or the public school system or any number of other social forces at work that work to undermine Yiddish. His response is there is no such thing as inevitability. He was an idealist, and he stressed this over and over again in his writings, that ideas shaped history, not objective social forces. Ideas shaped history. So if you had the right ideas, or in any case, if you had commitment to the right ideas, you could shape history. You could turn the historical forces in this direction or that direction if you have the will to do it. If you're only committed enough to do it, there is no inevitability. There are challenges. There are challenges on the road to building Yiddish culture, he said, but they're merely challenges. Nothing is insurmountable. And again, that's only, it has to be appreciated if you understand why Zhitlovsky thought the way he did about the United States. Again, it was based on a philosophical outlook of idealism. So because of that, he didn't deny the challenges to Yiddish. He simply saw them as challenges, not insurmountable obstacles. And again, he stressed the importance of ideas, the importance of Yiddish, the importance of Jewish nationalism, the importance of viewing America as a diverse country, the importance of socialism as a vehicle to achieve Jewish national rebirth, that he could believe so insistently that the United States could be a perfectly hospitable home to his goals of Yiddish cultural nationalism. I'll wrap this up by saying a few final comments about his overall outlook. Going into the 1920s, the 1930s, and into his final years, Zhitlovsky also, it's important to understand that Zhitlovsky looked at Jewish life on a global basis, not just what was happening in the United States, but what was happening in the major population centers of Eastern Europe and the emerging Yishuv in Palestine, the Jewish community of Palestine. And when he looked at things globally, he found reason for optimism. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 established the right to some kind of Jewish national home. Poland had accepted Jewish nationality rights, and the Soviet Union had recognized Jews as a nation. Beyond that, the Soviet Union had sponsored colonization of agricultural colonies of Jews in parts of Soviet Union, and then even established a Yiddish-speaking Jewish national home in Birobidzhan, in the eastern edge of the Soviet Union. So these things were incredibly inspiring to Zhitlovsky. He looked at these developments in Palestine, Poland, the Soviet Union, as signs that actually things were going his way in a really profoundly. The Soviet Union was especially encouraging to him. For several reasons. His argument about the Soviet Union was this, that the Soviet Union, as of the 1930s, had solved 3 of 4 aspects to the Jewish problem. He said that the Soviet Union had given Jews citizenship rights. In other words, they had emancipated the Jews. And they had emancipated the Jews at a time in the 30s when Nazi Germany and other countries coming into the fascist orbit were stripping Jews of their citizenship rights. So Soviet Union had emancipated Jews as individuals. If you just wanted to be a Soviet citizen, speak Russian, you could do that. Second, they had national cultural rights, which Zhitlovsky had been advocating since the 1890s. And the Soviet Union had granted to Jews very early on. They had Yiddish courts and schools and Yiddish, state-sponsored Yiddish theater, and beyond. So national cultural autonomy of sorts had existed now in Yiddish in the Soviet Union. Second problem solved. Third was Birobidzhan. Jews had a territory. So for those who had Zionist inclinations, here was a territory, a kind of Jewish homeland with Yiddish as its national language. The only part of the only Jewish goal, he said, that the Soviet Union could not deliver on was a Jewish homeland in Palestine, of course, because that didn't belong to the Soviet Union. So Palestine, as a solution to the Jewish problem, which he favored colonization in Palestine, but he said that was the only thing the Soviet Union hadn't achieved. So 3 of those 4 big goals, emancipation, national cultural autonomy, Jewish territorialization, had been achieved in the Soviet Union. And so that gave him a sense of optimism. I'll say as an aside, his characterization of the Soviet Union was let me to put it mildly, overly optimistic and rosy. Things in the Soviet Union weren't nearly as good as he imagined in the 30s and 40s. But he was saying this at a time when Stalin was consolidating power, and of course things were incredibly brutal in the Soviet Union. But looking at the Soviet Union from New York, through a Jewish, Yiddishist, nationalist lens, the Soviet Union provided him with hope, because it was setting up, as he saw it, structures that could advance the goals that he had been advocating for since the late 19th century. Of course, and I'll just say this by way of conclusion, things did not go Zhitlovsky's way for the most part by the end of World War II. The Soviet Union did not follow through on its commitment, its Jewish national commitments. It actually embarked on a process of coerced assimilation. It dismantled Yiddish cultural organizations for the most part. Elsewhere, the Jewish Yiddish-speaking population of Europe was decimated by the Holocaust. And the Soviet Union, in the United States, linguistic assimilation was well advanced by the 40s, and it accelerated very quickly into the 50s and 1960s. And then, of course, Israel's establishment, which I presume Zhitlovsky would have favored very much, did not give Yiddish the recognition that Zhitlovsky hoped for and demanded, and had always been critical of militant Hebraists who disrespected Yiddish and wouldn't have been pleased about that. So in those ways, Yiddish, as Zhitlovsky's vision, did not succeed for the most part. And again, I say that because it's important, I think, for understanding the obscurity into which he sunk. But what I've tried to do, in addition to explaining his views, is try to give a sense of how Zhitlovsky saw the world, how his worldview could seem realistic. I could say more about that, but I wanted to give at least a sense of how Zhitlovsky's views could seem plausible, not only to him, but a good number of his followers who he'd influenced during the first half of the 20th century. And with that, I'll stop, because I think we're at about 45 minutes or so, and I do want to leave time. I think there's time for some discussion.
Yes, absolutely. Tony, thank you so much for that wonderful and enlightening talk. That was terrific. We've got a lot of questions, so let's just dive in. There's a few different questions about religion. So you've talked about Zhitlovsky's ideas about nationalism as a kind of culture-based thing that would be especially rooted in language. Did religion have a role to play at all? And what was Zhitlovsky's relationship to religion later in his life?
So he was an atheist. He was a secularist and an atheist his entire adult life. As far as I know, he never changed that. I would say, as an aside, there were a good number of Yiddishists who in their own lives had been strongly influenced by Zhitlovsky, who started to, let's say, take religion a little more seriously than Zhitlovsky did, religion on its own terms. But no, for Zhitlovsky himself, he was always an atheist. Religion, wait, can you, I just actually lost track. What was the first question you had posed about religion?
Did religion play some kind of role in his concept of cultural nationalism? Yeah,
it did. Certainly religion played a role. It's a really important question. He did not seek to discard religion in its entirety. I think he would have said that would only impoverish Jewish culture and probably do some kind of violence to it. In other words, how do you tear religion off from Jewish civilization? It would have been too central for it. So he didn't view it that way. He viewed religion as playing a very important role. And he spoke of what he called the national poetic rebirth of Judaism. It was a phrase he used. What he meant, as far as I understand, what he meant by that is that religion could be a source of values, ideas, legends, stories, any number of things. It could be a source from which to draw in the building of Yiddish culture. This is not an alien idea in the Zionist Hebrew context. The same project was going on, but it was done in Hebrew. He called for this in Yiddish. And so, for instance, he would say, look, let's look at the Talmud as a source for understanding labor law, that there was much good to be learned in Jewish law when it came to how workers should be treated. That would be an example of how religion would be an important source, but he had many others. So when it came to anything from religion to philosophy to social thought, any number of things, religion could play a very positive role. But again, it had to be updated. This was crucial. It had to be updated. Religion had to be commensurate with modern, universal, humanistic values that socialism sought to achieve politically and economically. So it was what he was talking about was a strategic, selective borrowing from the religious past for the sake of building a Jewish future. How to deal with traditionalists? Well, that's another story. I mean, in the works I've read by Zhitlovsky, I don't see much where he addresses Orthodox Jews in the contemporary period. Nor I don't think did he address the question of what do you do when you have a portion of the population that simply doesn't accept his view of progress, his view of humanism. Then what do you do? I think his presumption simply was those people were probably going to disappear over time, that the forces of modernity were so strong and religion so weak on its own terms, and certainly under the pressures and the higher values of modernity, that religion was just going to disappear. That's my sense when I read Zhitlovsky, is that he just views those forces as being played out, the religious forces.
Someone has asked, did Zhitlovsky know Hebrew? Did he know it well?
He knew Hebrew, but I don't know the extent to which he knew, but he certainly knew Hebrew as part of his childhood upbringing.
And a few people have asked, what was his knowledge or awareness of other Jewish languages aside from Yiddish and Hebrew?
He was aware of Ladino, I know, at least on a couple of occasions. I have to tell you, I haven't read all, 18 volumes of his collected works. But I've read enough to know that he talked about Ladino. He recognized it as an important language and he affirmed it. He just didn't think it could play the role Yiddish could play because of the sheer numbers of Yiddish speakers. But he certainly saw it as an important part of Jewish civilization.
In the nation versus human race kind of dichotomy that you spoke about, what role did labor and class play in that, in his thinking?
Labor and class was central in his understanding of nationality. Again, this is where he comes into play as a socialist, not a Marxist socialist. I think alluded to that, but I should state it more explicitly. He was not a Marxist. But as a socialist, he viewed the toiling masses as, in the Jewish case, certainly in standing at the forefront of Jewish national rebirth. So on one level, that's simply because he viewed workers as at the forefront of social transformation. But also in the Jewish national case, it's because the majority of Yiddish-speaking Jews were workers in some fashion, either proletarians or small artisans or whatever, what he would call the working masses. So they had a special mission to play in the Jewish national renaissance. They were the bearers of Yiddish culture. This was their language, and they had a special role to play, I should say, because they did not face the the pressures to assimilate as strongly as the educated professional class who had to go to French, German, Russian, English-speaking universities to get their degrees, therefore had to assimilate linguistically, or they were not part of the bourgeoisie that had to be saw themselves as part of the larger bourgeoisie in whichever country they lived. So as his views, those were the strata, the upper educated and wealthier strata were the most susceptible to assimilation. And were also the classes that advocated assimilation often. They were the assimilationist, they were the bearers of assimilationist ideologies as he saw it. So the workers then, because they were so, as he would say, organically tied to the Jewish masses and their culture, they were very important. I'm going to say two more things about that. One is, this is not to say that he dismissed intellectuals. In fact, on the contrary, he viewed intellectuals as forming the political ideological vanguard of the Jewish national political renaissance. So what he wanted, again, he was an intellectual. He said intellectuals had a special role to play is the people who could create this advanced Yiddish language culture. They had the educational skills to do this. That their role would be to build an advanced culture at the highest levels so that future generations, up and coming generations of Yiddish speakers would not have to face the dilemma Zhitlovsky and his generation had to face. They had to make the choice. Are you a Yiddish speaker? Are you a Russian speaker? And often they veered towards Russian. And he was saying, we don't want that for the future. We want them, those up and coming generations who want to read Russian literature. They want to read great German novels. They want to study physics, that they will be able to do that in Yiddish and not have to choose between the Jew and the German or the Jew and the Russian. So only the intellectuals could do that. Only they could build the Yiddish schools. Only they could publish the textbooks. Only they could write translations of Karl Marx into Yiddish. So they had a task of building this culture at the advanced level. His critics said to him, he did a famous debate with Abraham Kahan of the Yiddish Vorwärts about this. His critics, like Kahn, said, what are you doing? You know, the masses can't read these books you're producing. They can't read your magazines. Who can understand what you're writing? Your sentences go on for paragraphs at a time. You write about philosophies no one's ever heard of, and the masses don't need it. You're an elitist, Zhitlovsky. And Zhitlovsky's response was what I just told you it was. He said, no, we're not elitist. I'm serving the cultural needs of the masses, even if they don't fully know it yet, but they are coming to understand it. So intellectuals were crucial, but the workers were crucial too. He understood intellectuals and workers, Yiddishist intellectuals and Yiddish-speaking workers in a special relationship that together, hand in hand, they would build this new Yiddish national culture. The other part of it, of course, was a socialist. He simply felt that workers were responsible for carrying through the economic transformation that Jews and everybody and all nations had to go through. That it's simply the economic poverty that they faced had to be overcome, could only be overcome through socialism, not through capitalism. So workers then had a dual mission. Much like, again, this is much like what the social Zionists were saying. They had a dual mission. They stood at the vanguard of social change, and they stood at the vanguard of Jewish national renaissance. So the workers were absolutely crucial. It was a national class analysis. Where he differed, I'll just say one more thing, where he differed from a good number of Jewish Marxists, and certainly many Bundists, was that Zhitlovsky believed in class cooperation when necessary. So if there were Jewish national goals that had to be achieved, he was okay with working with the bourgeoisie, where there were a good number of Marxists who wouldn't do that. Or sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. They were at least conflicted about this idea of when do you cooperate with Jews who were in the middle class or the upper class. Zhitlovsky didn't have that restraint. He said, yes, we can cooperate with them, provided we can find common goals. We shouldn't submit to them. We should cooperate with them when common ground could be found.
Is there anything else to say about his relationship to the Jewish Labor Bund during the interwar period?
In the interwar period, well, early on, he had, in the very early years of the Bund, so the Bund was founded, of course, in 1897, Zhitlovsky was not part of a political party, and he didn't join the Bund in those years. He flirted with the Bund. He talked with Bundists in Switzerland. They discussed things. They argued. But in the end, he didn't join. He didn't join in large measure because he wasn't a Marxist. The Bund was a Marxist party. I'll give you an example, actually. I'll give you an example of an interesting disagreement. I read to you a portion of his article, Zionism or Socialism. So that essay appeared first in a Bundist Yiddish newspaper, and it was reprinted in several newspapers. Well, a lot of the Bundist newspapers took out the final section of his essay from which I read. That large portion where he envisioned Yiddish schools and Yiddish civilization and Yiddish art, that was removed by some Bundist editors because they thought he had now gone too far over into the realm of Jewish nationalism. It sounded like Jewish nationalism to Bundists, and they thought it was just too extreme, and some just took it out. So that was a point of disagreement. So let me say now a couple more things. This was 1898. The Bundists had not arrived at their Jewish national program yet. They do that several years later. By 1903, they started talking about Jewish national autonomy. But in 1898, they weren't there yet. One reason they moved in that direction, one reason, not the only, is that Zhitlovsky was putting that idea forward of Jewish national cultural autonomy. The Bund accepted that idea, but not yet, not in the 1890s. The other difference, so Zhitlovsky was a full-throated nationalist in a way the Bundists at that time were not. They were taking steps towards that direction. There was a lot of internal division in the Bund about how nationalist or whether to be nationalist at all was a real debate. And he was sort of over it, if you will. He sort of said, I'm a nationalist and there's nothing wrong with it, period. Not period, sorry. I'm a nationalist, and here's how I'm a nationalist. I'm a nationalist in a socialist way, and it's totally legitimate. He was not a Marxist. I mentioned that already. The other difference was that even after the Bund arrived at its national program, emphasizing Yiddish as the national language of the Jewish people, calling for national cultural autonomy as the Bund did, Zhitlovsky took a step further again beyond the Bund when he said, Jews do need a territory. They aren't going to survive as a Yiddish-speaking cultural nation without a territory somehow. And Bundists never accepted that. I'd say in the 30s, jump further ahead, Bundists were more committed to a Yiddish cultural national project than they were before. And there were, Bundists never accepted territory, but there were Bundists who said, the situation is dire in Poland. And if Jews feel they have to go or can only go to Palestine, they should be allowed to go. That there shouldn't be restrictions placed on them in immigration to Palestine. Zhitlovsky, of course, thought that to be true. There's also true of communists. There were a lot of communists who said, we do not stand for a Jewish state in Palestine, but Jews should not be barred from going to Palestine, or no one should be barred from going to Palestine, Jews included. So, I would say that's not something Bundists, as far as I know, would have said in circa 1900, that, would have seen Palestine as a possibility for immigration. As far as I know, Bundists were not saying that in 1900. They had moved a little bit in the 1930s on that question.
We just have time for just a few more questions.
Sure.
A lot of people are curious about his relationship with Zionism and how it shifted and kind of articulating it. And one audience member, for example, asks, well, how could he support Zionism if he was into multiculturalism? Is that a contradiction? And other audience members are asking about his relationship with any Zionist figures, if there's anything we know about or that adds to the conversation.
So I'll first say that as far as I have seen, most of the attention, scholarly attention of Zhitlovsky's been paid to his early years, the 1880s, 1890s into the early 1900s, before he became a Zionist territorialist. And so I haven't seen a great deal of scholarship on him, certainly not enough. There's also some scholarship on his late period when he was close to the communists. So I just wanted to say that as a kind of caveat. But I can say this, that in the United States between, let's say, 1908 and World War I, he was certainly in dialogue and engagement and argument with various Zionist leaders, some of whom were quite important, because if you remember at the time, there were a lot of important Zionist leaders living in New York City. There was Nachman Sirkin, important Zionist socialist. Ber Borochov, the first Marxist Zionist, was in New York. David Ben-Gurion came to New York a few years later. So there were a lot of Zionists he certainly knew. He certainly knew them and argued with them and about a whole array of questions. So with Sirkin, for instance, Sirkin was an adamant Hebraist. He wrote in Yiddish all the time. He spoke in Yiddish, but he was not a Yiddishist. He was a Hebraist. So he disagreed, for instance, with Sirkin heatedly, vehemently when it came to Yiddish. Borochov was a Yiddishist as well as a Hebraist, so he could have common ground with him, but Borochov was a Marxist. So Zhitlovsky disagreed with Borochov on some of those issues. But then again, they collaborated on some major initiatives, such as the Jewish Congress movement, the movement to create a democratically elected nationwide Jewish parliament in the United States. And there he could agree with all the Zionists on the importance of that. So that's, I hope, in a kind of very quickly, where he stood in relation to some of these figures. If you took a step back, if you were a Gentile looking at the Jewish community, you might say all these people look pretty much the same to me. You know, they're all Jewish nationalists, they're all socialists, they're all territorialists in this group. But the closer you came in to what they believed, then you could see there were these differences as well as similarities. And I just named a few of them. When it came to Zhitlovsky, the multiculturalist, again, that's an anachronism. That's not a term anybody used at the time, let alone Zhitlovsky. Now, my understanding of his views on Palestine was that Palestine is a country of Jews and Arabs, and it should always be a country of Jews and Arabs. There's no problem there. Of course, there are a lot of Zionists who said the same thing, so that's not where he would have necessarily conflicted with Zionists. He would have conflicted with some Zionists on the nature of the Jewish state, the role of language and culture, who's within the nation, all these things of how to construct nationality. But it would have had no problem with the idea of an Arab-speaking nation sharing territory in Palestine with Jews. That would be entirely commensurate, actually, with his views of Russia and the United States.
So perhaps a final question just about his work in the United States. A few people have asked if he did work that had, any kind of on the grounds work, like, for example, was he involved in any work with Yiddish schools? Yeah. And similarly, was he involved in the Black national self-determination movement that was happening in the South?
Let me try to answer the second question first. So I haven't read everything he's written, and I should even say what makes this so challenging to cover all of Zhitlovsky is a lot of his works have been compiled in his Gesammelte Schriften, but he published a lot of columns in newspapers. He wrote regularly for a newspaper, a daily, Yiddish daily called Der Tag, a liberal left political daily. And so who knows what's in those newspapers? I mean, people just haven't compiled that stuff. I would be a little surprised if he never addressed the question of Black Americans. That would surprise me if he hadn't. One reason I say it is, first of all, it was a burning issue, especially by 1919, in the era of race riots, when there were dozens of race riots, meaning whites attacking Blacks in 1919. And those race riots, those pogroms, the Yiddish press called them pogroms against Black people, that was covered extensively in the Yiddish press. So he was well aware of it. All the newspapers covered it. Yiddish readers were well aware of the violence against Black people. And so I can't imagine Zhitlovsky didn't have some thoughts about it. His colleagues were writing about it. My hunch would be, it's just a hunch, that by the 1920s, when you saw three things happening in Black America. One, you had the huge internal migration, the Great Migration from South to North. Second, you had the Marcus Garvey movement, Black nationalism, the Pan-Africanist movement that was alluded to by the questioner. That was in full swing. It was a mass movement among Black people. The third, of course, you have the Harlem Renaissance and the birth of the, quote, new Negro. You have this cultural effervescence in Harlem and Chicago, elsewhere. And all that's happening in the 20s. My bet is Zhitlovsky viewed all of this and said, this is good. This is more proof that I'm right. This is what America's about. And now, I don't know what, if he read, Langston Hughes or anything like that. My guess is he didn't, although some of that was available in Yiddish, so maybe he did. I don't know. I mean, look, I shouldn't even speculate. I think the farthest speculation I can go with my speculation is he was certainly aware of this. It's not speculation. I'd speculate that he approved. I can't imagine he didn't. Beyond that, I can't say. Beyond that is that I know by circumstantial evidence he was well aware of it, because Yiddish intellectuals, journalists, and so forth were writing about Black Americans a lot in the war years and into the 20s and 30s. Now, the question about Yiddish schools was, yes, he was very important to that movement. He came up with the idea, I believe he was the first, certainly one of the first, to advocate for Yiddish schools. The socialist Zionists and territorialists were the first to start Yiddish schools. That was in, I believe, 1908, maybe 1906, but certainly 1908 in America. The Bundists were slower to do that. For a host of political reasons and constraints, they lagged a little bit behind what Zionists and socialist territorialists were doing. But his role was an ideologue. His role was a theoretician. His role was not a political activist. Zhitlovsky was not a political activist. He did not form a party. He did not lead a party. So what he did was he was like a figurehead and a theoretician and an ideologue. He gave the speeches. He wrote the programmatic articles. He wrote the theories of America. He explained why Yiddish schools were so important. And then there were a lot of activists of various levels, grassroots, little higher, men and women. They started building Yiddish schools, starting at grade schools, and then building up from there to more advanced levels. And then that caught on beyond the Zhitlovskyite Yiddishist circles. So communists built their schools in the 20s and 30s, and Bundists, before the communists, were building their Yiddish schools. But many of the ideas, much of the impetus for those Yiddish secular schools came from Zhitlovsky. In the schools, there were 3 or 4 streams of Yiddish secular schools. The ones closest to Zhitlovsky's outlook were called the Sholem Aleichem schools. Those were most closely aligned with Zhitlovsky's overall vision. You had socialist Zionist schools that were not quite Zhitlovskyite, although there was an influence there. And then you had more Bundist-oriented schools that were associated with the Arbeiter Ring and so forth. So yes, in short, Zhitlovsky had a formative influence on the Yiddish school movement.
All right, well, there's many more questions, but I think we're just about out of time. So Tony, thank you so much for this. This was wonderful.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody for attending. I can't see anybody, but you're out there, and I want to thank you for your questions and attending, and I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you all so much for coming, and we hope to see you or learn with you again soon.
I hope to be back soon. Take care. Good luck with the Zoomer
program.
Seid gesund and stark.